It's been about a week and a half since the election results, and the news is coming in fast and furiously. So we thought we would check in with Michael Tomasky. He is editor of the New Republic to get his take on what's happening, what the election meant, and how Trump won. But first and foremost, Michael, I have to ask you about these appointments because we're hearing them one after the other. And for people who are not necessarily caught up with everything that's going on, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, obviously Senator from Florida, Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, Matt Gaetz, Attorney General.
Yeah.
I can't wait to hear what you have to say about that. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, Elise Stefanik, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, Department of Government Efficiency, Lee Zeldin, EPA Administrator, Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, and Thomas Homan as border czar. Take it away, Michael.
Well, Katie, this ranges from, terrifying to absurd. I just wrote on Blue Sky, there must be, one of those long German words for the exact combination of tragic and ridiculous that this group of people represents. Uh, on the serious end of the spectrum, Homan, for sure. I think number one. I think that guy means business when he talks about breaking up families or keeping them together and just deporting the whole family. So he's a scary choice. Stephen Miller, with whom we've been
Oh, I
familiar
didn't
with for
mention Stephen Miller.
yeah for a long time, who's going to be in the office next to Trump's and who's going to be also in charge of this deportation plan. Those are the terrifying ones. Marco Rubio is the one that I think people actually breathed a little sigh of relief, that he didn't decide to make Hulk Hogan his Secretary of State or something. Yeah, Rubio obviously doesn't have my politics, but he's a senator and
And he's a serious thinker and for
yeah,
a long time has been on the Senate Intelligence Committee. So he basically has the knowledge and the background to serve in that role. I've heard the
yeah.
same thing from people saying that he makes sense and isn't as sort of head scratching as some of the other choices.
That's true. I agree with that. The only concern about Marco Rubio, of course, is that he's not the president and Donald Trump is, and he's going to be going over to Kyiv and Moscow and doing what Donald Trump wants him to do. But at least he's a grown up. Uh, Gates, the one that just recently came through here as we're speaking, is just way beyond comprehension, even
Well,
for a
tell
lot
me
of
why,
Republicans.
because not everyone follows these personalities and these figures as closely as someone like you.
Yeah.
Why Matt Gaetz? Why is
Well,
that so
yeah,
shocking?
he's a bomb thrower in the House of Representatives. He's not there to do anything constructive. He's there to be a complete ideological, incendiary figure. And so that's one thing. But another thing is that he was investigated by the Justice Department, for inappropriate relations with an underage woman. And other Republicans, Mark Wayne Mullen, the now senator from Oklahoma, but former House member, just told CNN, I believe it was, that Gates used to brag about these conquests on the floor of the House and show them pictures and things like that. So, he may be the first person nominated to head the Justice Department who's actually been investigated by the Justice Department. I can only imagine what is being said by the many, 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 Katie. As you know, these departments are filled by really serious people. People like Gates, decry and denounce these agencies of the executive branch as the deep state. And they've said that over and over again. And it's very poisonous, very toxic rhetoric. The Justice Department is, in fact, filled with thousands of hardworking and dedicated and decent and honest people who work through Democratic and Republican administrations, who do their jobs, who could be out in the private sector making three times, four times what they're making, but decide that their career is public service. I'm sure they're just apoplectic about this.
I wanted to ask you about the incoming Secretary of Defense, a gentleman named Pete Hegseth, who I guess went to Princeton and Harvard at the Kennedy School up at Harvard, served, courageously in Iraq and Afghanistan, but doesn't seem necessarily to have the experience of running a huge operation
Yeah.
like the Defense Department and all of the military installations worldwide. Were you surprised by that choice?
Surprise is the wrong word when it comes to Donald Trump. I mean, a Fox News host is a quite logical choice for Donald Trump. But it's a shocking choice, not to me. It's not my opinion that matters. It's people in the military, people in who work in that building. Many of whom, according to reports, are completely shocked by this. Yeah, he served his country. We applaud that. Good for him. But he wasn't a career military person. He didn't rise in the ranks and become a commander of any kind. And he's never run a big organization, a big corporation. And he said a lot of things about the military that suggest that just his priority is going to be that he thinks the military is too woke and too consumed with DEI priorities, and that's all he's going to come in there and want to do. He said commanders or people of high rank who have facilitated this wokeness at the Pentagon are going to be in his gun sights, so to speak.
While we're on that topic, Michael, I wanted to ask you about this draft executive order calling for a warrior board of retired senior military personnel with the power to review 3 and 4-star officers and to recommend removals of any deemed unfit for leadership. Does that align with what you just said about the desire to really not focus on diversity in the ranks and some of the acceptance of transgender military officers and soldiers, et cetera?
Well, yeah, it aligns with all that, Katie, and it also aligns with the idea that they need to be loyal not to the Constitution of the United States, but to Donald Trump. He has said, "I want Hitler's generals." Now, he doesn't know what he's talking about because some of Hitler's generals turned against Hitler, most notably the most famous one, Erwin Rommel, also Paulus in Stalingrad. But when he says, "I want Hitler's generals," he means, in his historically ignorant way, that he wants complete fealty, complete personal fealty. It wouldn't shock me if he wants our soldiers someday to take an oath not to the Constitution of the United States, but to him, which is also something Adolf Hitler did in 1934. But even putting Hitler aside, if people think that's going too far, that's what that commission that you brought up is about. It's
It
about
also
making sure that they're loyal to Trump.
It also seems, Michael, like it's retribution for some of the statements that his former generals have made about him. General John Kelly saying at his core he's a fascist. Mark Milley obviously was very critical. General Mattis didn't really come out too publicly, but
Right.
his resignation had some very critical things to say about Donald Trump. So, in a way, I think, at least I've read, that he feels that they put, gosh, safeguards around some, I guess we would call them safeguards. He would call them obstacles
Right.
around some of the things he wanted to achieve when he was president the first go round. So I guess he's making sure, as you said, that everyone is subservient to him and his wishes and pledge fealty to him rather than the Constitution. I'm just repeating what you said, but
Well, it's what he said. It's that's what matters. He said it many times during his first term and since. Uh, the president is the law. The president should be able to do what he wants. If the president says it's legal, and as you know, aping Nixon. And if the president says it or does it, it's fine. And now we have a United States Supreme Court, 6 of whose members have agreed, in essence, with that. And so, if he goes to, have one of these military leaders arrested and prosecuted for some crime that he finds from some 1838 statute. What's to stop him? Nothing's to stop him. Not the Supreme Court either, apparently.
Well, I wanted to talk to you, even though we're only, gosh, we're just a little over a week since the election, and there's still a lot of self-flagellation happening with the Democrats, a lot of people really trying to understand what happened and what went wrong. And you recently wrote, I think, a really interesting newsletter about what you saw was one of the primary reasons for Kamala Harris's defeat. You write, you
Yeah.
asked the question why people ignored Donald Trump's status as a convicted felon and adjudicated rapist, why they overlooked so many of his disgusting imprecations. I don't know that word. I'm going to have to look it up, Michael. And why they didn't see Harris, whatever her shortcomings, was a fundamentally smart, honest, well-meaning person who would show basic respect for the Constitution. And you say the simple answer, three words, right-wing media. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the evolution of right-wing media and how it's really become a right-wing media industrial complex.
Yeah, it really has, and it's a really important point. First of all, let me stipulate that, I'm not saying that inflation wasn't important and that other factors that people point to in their motivation for their vote aren't important. I know I said that kind of at the beginning of the piece. I was trying to get people's attention. Yeah, so I'm not talking in this piece about voters' motivations. I'm talking, though, about a larger historical context of a situation that we have in this country through which people get their information, because media is where people get their information and decide how to make their decisions. So the situation is this. We don't really have a single media in this country, Katie. When we talk about the media, we often say the media this, the media that, but we have two medias. We have the mainstream media, which is the traditional sources, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the major networks, and so on. But then we have a separate, avowedly right-wing media that's a completely different thing. When I say that, people will instantly think of Fox News, and Fox News, of course, is the most prominent element within this, but there are many, many other elements in it. There are other cable channels like One American News and Newsmax. There's Sinclair, which owns a lot of local TV and radio stations all across the country. There's a network of right-wing talk radio. There's a network of Christian talk radio. And then in the newer media, in the social media, there's loads of TikTokers and YouTubers and podcasters who all do essentially the same thing. They are against the mainstream media, and they have a set of they have a way of seeing the world that, let's just put it that way, is really, really different from the mainstream media, and they speak with a unified voice. And
That
they
is so
say,
important for you to
yeah,
point out, Michael, because in your article you talk about they get their power from this very repeated singular message that is spread across all these different outlets and platforms and companies. Talk about that a little bit more.
yeah. Um, as I said, they speak with a single voice. They have a very ideological and very political mission. Their mission isn't to report the truth. Their mission is to get a desired political outcome. And so their voice says, their unified voice says, Democrats hate you. Democrats are elitists and they have contempt for you and they want to turn your son into your daughter. And the only line of defense against these evil people is Donald Trump and electing other Republicans. And so that's what they say, and they say it over and over and over, and they repeat it ad nauseum, and they find different examples, different instances of grievance politics to get their viewers and readers and listeners upset about. And also, they don't really care whether it's true or not a lot of the time. I mean, they don't care about that at all, actually. So the great example from this campaign is the Haitians eating the cats and dogs. That started as a post on Facebook by some guy. And then it got
Using a
picked.
second or third source.
Yes, right, right, exactly. And then it got picked up on X, and all the conservative influencers started repeating it. And then it got onto Fox and these other cable networks. Then it got into the right wing media. Then it got into the mainstream media. And that's when J.D. Vance decided to mention it. So J.D. Vance didn't start this. People may be under the impression that he started it. No, he was just picking up something that had been building and building in the right wing media. And then Vance mentioned it, and then Trump mentioned it. And then once they mention it, then it becomes a mainstream story that the mainstream media starts to pick up. And people who are consuming mainstream news, they don't really know what the truth is. Now, it was pretty well and pretty effectively debunked by the mainstream press. But once you hear something like that, you can't unhear it.
And it wasn't debunked for several days, we should
Right.
point out. I mean, it was circulating far and wide. And you give other examples of that about aid for the victims of Hurricane Helene going to illegal immigrants. That gained some traction on these smaller micro platforms and then burst onto the scene nationally as well.
I think that one did some damage potentially to Harris. The hurricane went through North Carolina and Georgia as it happened, particularly North Carolina. And in all those states, the media was saying to people, "Hey, they took money that you should be getting right now to help you, and they're giving it to undocumented people." Not true, not true at all. FEMA did have a program, a separate funding stream for border related incidents, but it had nothing to do with this money. It had no impact on this money at all. But they say these things and say them and say them and say them, and the old saying that a lie gets around the world before the truth can even get its pants on.
You also talk about the fact that this right wing media conglomerate, I guess, if you want to put all the puzzle pieces together, they actually set the agenda for the news cycle. Back in my day, it
Yeah,
was the New York Times and the Washington Post. I'd like to think the Today Show sometimes did in the morning,
yeah,
once in a while, and much more mainstream media outlets. How did they lose their hold on the American consciousness? Is it the fact that they didn't have this singular message that was being talked about on a regular basis? How did they lose their foothold in America?
yeah. First of all, I think it's still Katie Couric's day, by the way. But but yes, I think you're right. I think because the mainstream media doesn't have an ideological agenda in the same way that the right wing media does. Now, a right wing person would hear that and would laugh and chuckle and say, "You've got to be kidding." But I'm sorry, it's true. They just don't. The New York Times, yeah, the New York Times has an editorial page that endorses Democrats, but the New York Times news pages don't have any kind of agenda. The executive editor of the paper made that clear in a couple of high profile interviews this year, named Joseph Kahn. He said it's not our job to protect democracy. It's our job to lay these issues out to people and let them make their best decision. And so yeah, they just don't have that driven agenda in the way that the right wing media does. And then the other thing is the right wing media has grown and grown and grown over these last 30 years. And mainstream media, sadly, has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk as papers have died off and local news has been suffocated, and there have been so many layoffs. So, probably 1/10 the people work at the New York Daily News as worked there 30 years ago.
Well, one of the
Uh,
reasons you say the right wing media is thriving is because of billionaires propping up these outlets. So, what did you mean by that exactly, Michael?
well, over the years, they've poured a lot of money into these properties because they understand that the media is very important. So, you know, the New York Post, for example, would be the prime instance here. Loses many, many, many millions of dollars. Now, Murdoch makes up for it with Fox. Fox makes a lot of money. By the way, from carrying charges that if you're a cable subscriber, you pay. You and I pay Fox News a little bit of money every month if we're cable subscribers, which I still am. Um, so, but over these years, not just Murdoch, but Reverend Moon at the Washington Times, other owners, they've sunk many, many millions of dollars into these properties because they know how important media is. Now, some of them have turned around and made a profit, and that's great. They have found an audience. We can't deny that. But some of them don't make a profit. But even so, they continue to underwrite them, these billionaires, because they just know how important media is. And liberal multimillionaires haven't done the same thing over these
And if
years.
they
And that's,
have, like Jeff Bezos, or even if you're thinking about John Malone at CNN,
yeah,
both have tried to move those outlets to the center, or they're thinking that they're too liberal.
yeah.
What is your take on that?
Well, it's it's pretty disappointing, and I think it's pretty wrong-headed. I mean, I don't think CNN's not going to steal many viewers, not going to steal many Republican conservative viewers from Fox News. It's just not going to happen. Um, so
But do you
I think
think that the Washington Post and CNN were too liberal? I always have a hard time wrapping my head around this, because if you cover someone like Donald Trump fairly and you point out his lies and his agenda, you're automatically tarred with the liberal brush. But if
yeah.
you're actually trying to report on him honestly in a fact-based way, you're really not.
Yeah, of course they're not too liberal. They're probably not liberal enough. They're in the sense that they didn't really tell enough of the truth about what Donald Trump was saying, and didn't really make plain enough to people the stakes of this election. But it's not even a matter of liberal conservative. It's a matter of doing aggressive good journalism, and not doing aggressive good journalism. You know, uh, but you're right. That's the conundrum, and the right wing is very good at this too. Uh, if if they run a series of tough pieces on Donald Trump, liberal media, liberal media, liberal media, and executives at these places are very afraid, I think, of being tarred in that way. And so, coverage gets tailored a little bit. Yeah, I understand. They point to this study where Kamala Harris got very positive coverage and Donald Trump got very negative coverage. Well, that covered a time period where Kamala Harris was she was just out there being a normal candidate, giving normal speeches. She wasn't lying every sentence that came out of her mouth. Donald Trump was.
I do think a lot of aggressive reporting was done during the course of this campaign. Really good, investigative, innovative reporting by outlets like ProPublica, for example.
Right.
The point you make in your piece is that because of this bifurcated news and information ecosystem, so many of people who are on a steady diet of Fox News, The Post, Christian radio, right-wing radio, Sinclair Broadcasting, which really makes sure their local news is conservative and pro-Republican, they're not going to see that stuff because they have myopically been fed and focused on that other narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. This is another big problem. I'll never forget the woman who was interviewed. I forget who interviewed her. It may have been CNN, may have been MSNBC. This is after the Mueller report came out. And she said, wait, the Mueller report said something negative about Donald Trump? I never heard that. I don't know that. Are you sure that's true? I didn't see that. Well, because the news uh, channel that she watches didn't say that, didn't tell her that. And this colors everything. This didn't just color the campaign. It colors, the way people perceive Joe Biden, the way people perceive Joe Biden's economy, the way people perceived his handling of a whole bunch of situations. Look, inflation is real, as I said earlier. I go to the grocery store too. I know that, my shopping cart used to cost $120 and now costs $155. I know that. That's painful. If people just wanted to punish the in power party over inflation, so be it. And that's what we got. But there was a lot of economic news that was real and that just never got reported and could never compete with that story. I mean, people's wages, this is an average, so it doesn't apply to everybody, but wages now outpace inflation by a lot. And, certain kinds of spending have been up in the last couple of years, kinds of spending that indicate that people actually, have money in their pockets. And the polls, while people say, yes, the country is in a bad direction and yes, the economy is bad, most people, when they're asked about their own individual circumstance, they say things are pretty good. We're doing okay. So a lot of that just got lost and buried and completely unreported.
And things obviously are improving just in time for Donald Trump to assume office. And you write that he's likely to take credit for the return of a lot of positive trends and news. Before we go, I wanted to ask you about another aspect of this, which you didn't really address in your piece, but I think is worth mentioning. I think it's worth mentioning the manosphere real quickly, Michael, before we
Yeah.
go, because apparently they were really energized by this election. And when I talk about the manosphere, I'm talking about the emergence of these so-called bro podcasters like Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, Russell Brand, etc. And obviously these other platforms where a lot of young men or middle-aged men congregate. And those audiences really came out in support of Donald Trump. What do you think of that in terms of this trend of this whole pack of men who are ascribing to a certain philosophy that is pretty toxic, I have to say, probably a bad word because I'll be accused of being a feminazi, but even though uh, Rush Limbaugh is no longer alive. He used to call me that. But,
Yeah.
this is a whole new demographic of people that obviously Donald Trump very successfully tapped into. Are they part of this right-wing media expanding ecosystem, you think?
Yeah, they are. They are. That's the media now, Katie. I read a poll earlier this year that didn't exactly stun me, but sort of depressed me. Uh, Percentage of people who got their news from newspapers anymore, 10%. 10%. Percentage of people who got their news from TV and radio, those were both somewhere in the 40s. Percentage of news of people who got their news from social media was 75 or so. And most of that is conservative. Now, again, this is like bully for them in a way. They did this, they built this, and liberals haven't built a counterpart, and they need to get to it. But it's where people get their information now. Joe Rogan's endorsement of Trump moved. What do you think? 20 times the votes that the New York Times' endorsement of Kamala Harris moved. 50 times the votes.
I
And
know
that's
it
the
was
new.
listened to, last I checked, 47 million people.
Yeah.
And of
Yeah.
course, then you have to um, you know, consider how often that's repeated on other outlets and short sound bites, et cetera.
Exactly.
The
Exactly.
virality of
Yeah.
a conversation like that and the impact it has.
It's enormous. And Democrats and their benefactors really need to understand this. I've been trying to say this to people for 20 years. Uh, and it's not that I was a particular genius. Other people saw this happening too. But now it's at a crisis point, and it's not like it's going to stop, Katie. That's the last point I guess I'd make to you.
In fact, can I quote your article? If you
Yeah,
think they're done, you're in fantasy land. They're not happy with the rough parity, the slight advantage they have now. They want media domination. Sinclair bought the once glorious Baltimore Sun. Don't think they'll stop there. I predict Sinclair or News Corp will own the Washington Post one day, maybe sooner than we think. So I guess the question, Michael, is what can be done about this?
well, liberals have to make a concerted effort, as Republicans did 20 and 30 years ago, to build their own media. and it has to be smart. It has to be good. It has to entertain. It has to get an audience. It all those burdens will apply to it. So it has to be good and succeed, but they just have to start doing something about this, and they have to try to reach into middle America and talk to people there, because there are so many just vast swaths of the country where the idea of liberalism and the name of the Democratic Party are just dirt. And I cited also in the piece an example. The voters of Missouri voted to protect abortion rights on one ballot initiative, and they voted for paid family leave and a higher minimum wage. In other words, they voted for these very democratic liberal things, right? And by reasonably comfortable margins on those. But would they? They wouldn't elect a Democrat in a million years. The Democratic candidate for Senate, Lucas Kunz, who ran against Josh Hawley, ran a good race, had money, won the debate, didn't come within 14, 15 points. So, work has to be done, especially in those parts of the country where Democrats used to win. It wasn't that long ago that there was a Democratic senator from Missouri, Claire McCaskill, or Democratic senators from Iowa, even Arkansas. But it just seems inconceivable now. So the party needs to rebuild in those places. And part of that story is media rebuilding.
So what I'm hearing is that the liberals or Democrats need to develop their own network, their own vast network of media entities. Does that mean sort of news that reported just the facts, that wasn't based in opinion, that let people know what was going on and tried to give context is just a thing of the past?
No, I don't think so. I think the facts are kind of on liberalism's side. That's one thing. I mean, and most people support a lot of things that liberals are for. Most people support a higher minimum wage, as that Missouri vote shows. Most people support paid family leave. Most people support tax increases for the wealthy. You go down these issues, child tax credit. Most people are for these things. So I don't think it means the end of it. It means the end of a certain kind of neutrality. But that neutrality has been disrobed, I think, over the last 20 years. It's not enough to say this side says this and this side says that, and we won't referee it. That hasn't worked. That hasn't worked. It means just refereeing it. And telling people the truth, putting truth ahead of fairness. That's what I always say, Katie. There are these two values of the media, as you know, that are our traditional values: to be fair and represent both points of view or all points of view, but also to be truthful and tell the truth. I think, and this is true, I'm sad to say, of the New York Times in many cases, although the New York Times remains a great newspaper and does tons of great reporting. Uh, they they sometimes, when those two values clash, they sometimes put fairness ahead of truth. We've got to put truth ahead of fairness.
What about bolstering local news? Margaret Sullivan has written so much about this, as you know, Michael,
Yeah.
that thousands of local news outlets, whether you're talking about newspapers or radio stations or all kinds of places, have shut down since the early 2000s. And when people are involved or engaged with local news, they are more informed, and
Right.
then they are likely to be more engaged in national issues. But these news deserts really leave a vacuum where these right-wing media outlets can just fill the void.
Yeah. If one of these rich people said, okay, Tomasky, here's $500 million, what are you going to do with it? That's the first thing, I think, or among the first things I would do. Local news, local news, local news. And that doesn't have to be capital L liberal or ideological at all, Katie. That would just be, as you say, telling people what's going on, informing people about what's happening in their communities, in their towns, in their state, just so that they're informed again, so that they're not just relying on this stream of propaganda that is at best one third true. these news deserts are a huge, huge problem. And now we've got this, what's it called? Slime, pink slime sites that look to the unsuspecting consumer like they're fair and good news reporting, but they're just like right-wing AI things. Where does this stop?
Michael Tomasky from the New Republic. So fun to talk to you. Well, not
Yeah.
fun, depressing actually.
Oh,
But
come
I
on.
really, I
Thanks a
really
lot.
appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Katie. It's a great pleasure.